Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars. SoundCartel. From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. Melo Calarco has always had a taste for adventure. He's confronted a raging silverback gorilla in the Rwandan jungle. He's had a soldier's machine gun forced into his ribs in Uganda, and he survived a heavy case of malaria in Benin. Along the journey, he's learned to master techniques to help him overcome those stressful situations. Techniques that can be applied in a business setting too, which he shares from his book, Beating Burnout, Finding Balance. So, how does one go about beating burnout? Melo tells Chris Ashmore that the first step is self-awareness.
As I often say, you can't change what you don't notice. And often it can sneak up on you without even noticing. Actually, in fact, when I was writing my book, I interviewed about 200 people for the book that actually had experienced burnout. And 90% of the people that I spoke to didn't realise they were burning out until it was too late.
So if you say self-awareness is the first step, how then do you suggest people become self-aware?
One of the best tools to develop self-awareness is mindfulness practice, so training in mindfulness. And there's two main ways to train mindfulness. One is the formal practice, which is actually stopping, pausing, tuning into the body, tuning into the breath, listening to the body, listening to the sensations present. So that's what you might call a meditation practice, let's say. But there's also what's called the non-formal practice. And the non-formal practice is doing all those things that you do in the day, but you do them more mindfully, like brushing your teeth or going for a walk or driving the car. Instead of being in this default mode where you don't notice things, you train your awareness to be more present in these things. So both of these are equally important in my eyes, the formal practice of stopping and then the non-formal practice of noticing your day-to-day activities more. So it's a great way to develop it.
Well, if we look at burnout more precisely, what is burnout exactly?
What is burnout? So burnout's the end consequence in many ways of not looking after yourself, unmanaged workplace stress, and it's a constant evolution. So it's cumulative in many ways. So the end result basically is burnout where you are not coping anymore, you're not functioning anymore. And that's usually three main things that happens here. Number one is just exhausted, like absolutely physically and mentally exhausted. So that feeling of depletion. Number two is that disconnected feeling. So you might be disconnected to yourself, disconnected to family, friends, your workplace, and maybe even a bit negative or cynical. So that's number two sort of criteria. And number three is that lack of efficacy. So inefficiency, unable to do things that you could normally do, but there's so much more effort now and you just can't do that. So by the time it reaches burnout, it's poor functionality, basically.
Are there different stages of burnout?
Oh, definitely. So in many ways, I find it's really hard to have exact stages, like the 6 stages or the 5 stages. In my book, I talk about 7 stages of burnout, but it's really hard to have a definitive model because there's many factors and many different situations for different people. But typically, often stage 1 of burnout is actually when you work tirelessly hard or relentlessly hard to prove yourself at work. And when you start doing that, all the other things that you actually have in place, like your self-care practices, like exercise or good nutrition and good sleep, start falling away. So your self-care starts being lapsed. And then it's basically a cumulative effect over a few stages. And the end stage is then, like I said, poor functionality, not being able to function. And it might reach a crisis point, like you might have a panic attack, you might have some sort of physiological symptoms that you didn't notice before, and then you have some sort of sudden crisis. So the various stages in between 1 and 7, let's say, is just constantly, progressively getting worse, into anxiety, depression, and things like that.
Now, your book, Beating Burnout, Finding Balance, what is balance and how do we achieve balance?
Wow, that's a big question. What is balance? In many ways, balance is when we can balance the two sort of polar opposites. So most people in this fast, busy world that we are working in, we're sitting in the sympathetic nervous system. constantly. So we're sitting in this fight and flight mode, trying to meet our demands. The opposite of the sympathetic nervous system is what's called the parasympathetic nervous system. So that's that relaxation response, or that nice, easy, getting some downtime. So in an ideal world, to get homeostasis or balance, we balance those two things out. So working really hard when you need to work hard, but also having tools to switch off, mechanisms that you can slow down, and making sure you're having downtime, whether that's meditation or whether that's doing some of your hobbies and interests. So having that nice ideal balance of both of those.
Now, also in your book, Melo, there's a lot of anecdotes about when you were travelling and the exotic places you've been to. Where does that passion come from, this world travel?
Good question. I think it's just as a child, I always wanted more in life. I was brought up in little old Adelaide, so a very small little town in South Australia, and it's a bit limited there in scope. So I knew there was more out there, and I always wanted to go travel. And for me, I'm very interested in culture and very interested in different cultures, especially Indigenous cultures. So I just had this yearning to see the world and experience different cultures and learn from them as much as possible, learn their ancient wisdoms, their spiritual practices, and their cultural practices. So just an innate need and desire to constantly learn in many ways.
Well, you've found yourself in a few tricky situations when you've been travelling. Can you relay one of those stories?
Oh, there's more than one, that's for sure. Pretty much every single border crossing, especially in places like Africa and some of those developing countries, is a situation on its own, often very corrupt in many ways. And when you get to a border, they often want your watch or your sunglasses or your shoes or some bribery or some money. So I learned very quickly that patience is great. So having some patience is one of the best things. And I might often pull out the cards and play cards, play solitaire by myself for hours on end before I'd get through the border. And a sense of humour goes a long way. A sense of humour, making some jokes, making some fun with people. And then you often diffuse many situations. And even I remember a situation in Nepal when, I'm not sure if you remember, but the whole royal family was assassinated. It was in 2001. And Nepal, Kathmandu, went crazy. It was a bit of a riot place and shoot at sight orders for curfews. And it was a very dangerous place. So I had to try to get out of Nepal and literally fight my way through the airport with my backpack and, bash my way through the airport. But again, patience and a sense of humour got me through. So I learnt those two mechanisms are really handy to get through any tricky situation, really.
Patience and a sense of humour. Resilience too, I suppose, that you've learnt that on your travels.
Well, if you don't learn resilience, I'm not sure you'll survive, basically. So resilience comes naturally from being resilient in certain situations. You learn to be very street smart, obviously, being in those sort of countries where there are knives and guns and muggings and things like that. So you learn to be very street smart and build that resilience. And what I learned along the way is not to worry about the next place or the next thing or the next situation, because otherwise you'd be this anxious, nervous mess. But what I learned was, to build resilience, to believe in yourself and believe that no matter what happened to you, you would always have the resources inside of you to cope with it. No matter how difficult, no matter how hard it was, you always had those resources inside of you. So having that trust is a big one.
Would it be fair to say, I know this is a leading question, but having these different kinds of experiences that are so removed from where we are today, it helps with running a business or being in business?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. All the lessons that I learned on the road, all those lessons of, resilience and rising above adversity and patience and trust and compassion and kindness, every single lesson that I learned is definitely translated in my business. I also run a small business, so to speak, and I draw upon these lessons every single day. Every single day. It helps me to be more resilient, to be more patient, to create space, to work better, to work smarter. So without a doubt.
If there was one place in the world you would recommend someone to go to get out of their comfort zone, perhaps not too far out of their comfort zone, and discover a place that's not on the tourist map, where would that be?
The Himalaya is one of my favourite places on earth. So I know geographically it's quite far, but there's a place up there called Ladakh. Ladakh is in the Indian Himalaya. and it's absolutely stunning and beautiful. It's a high altitude desert, so very interesting. The jungles of Africa, in Cameroon, where there's pygmy tribes, which I visited, also beautiful. But if you don't want to go geographically so far and you want to stick a bit closer to Australia, I would suggest even Tasmania and New Zealand has some amazing wilderness, which is very accessible, even though you're quite close to cities, but you still can be far removed and get quite deep in wilderness quite quickly. So Tasmania and New Zealand, don't underestimate them, close places, but also quite deep in the wilderness.
That was Melo Calarco, author of Beating Burnout, Finding Balance. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow @BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.